Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's Druid Summit. My name is FJ. I'm one of the co-creators behind Druid, and I'm one of the PMC members as well. I'm also a co-founder and CEO at Imply, which is a technology company based in Silicon Valley that was founded to commercialize Druid as well as continue its development in the open source. So my talk today is called Real-Time Analytics in the Real World. And what I want to cover as part of this talk is really about how Druid and the real-time analytics space has evolved. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Druid, some of the main initiatives that we've been working on, and how the project and the space is growing and expanding. So to first start off with a brief history of Druid, if you didn't know, Druid was first created a little over 10 years ago, and we created it to actually power a user-facing analytics dashboard. So the co-founders at Imply about a decade ago were actually all developers, and we were working at the startup that was trying to create a user-facing analytics product for digital advertising. We tried many different types of databases. We tried many different types of product to power this user-facing advertising dashboard that we want to build. And ultimately, none of them really worked. So we embarked on this journey to build Druid. If you're familiar with Druid, then you know Druid was really created from the ground up for high volume, high velocity, high complexity event streams. And over the years, after we built Druid, we decided to open source it because we thought we had some pretty novel ideas in the architecture and really want to share the project with a wider community. When we first created Druid, we had one kind of use case figured out, and we wanted to understand what else was possible with Druid, what other use cases could the community discover. Over the years, the open source Druid community has grown very rapidly, and it's been awesome to see for someone that's been working on the project since the very beginning. We've got to learn more and more about the different types of use cases that are possible. And nowadays, we call all these different use cases kind of under the umbrella of real-time analytics. What started out as a single use case for digital advertising has now spawned dozens of different use cases, all with kind of very similar characteristics. When Druid was first created, we kind of had one initial use case in mind. But definitely in the last few years, we've started realizing the project has certain limitations. There's much more that we can do with it, and there's much more that we wanted to do with it. So a little while ago, we started this project called Shapeshift. It's kind of a callback to Druid's origins and Druid's name coming from World of Warcraft. But we started this project called Shapeshift, and the idea behind Project Shapeshift was to really rebuild Druid from the ground up to make it much better for some of the existing use cases that we've seen in real-time analytics, as well as future use cases that we anticipate. So if you've been following Project Shapeshift, you know that usually once a quarter or several times a year, we'll do announcements about how the project has been going. As I mentioned before, our vision really around Project Shapeshift has been this idea to really rebuild Druid's core engine and to build it from the ground up to support a growing number of use cases in real-time analytics. Over the last several quarters, over the last more than a year, we've been doing periodic releases to Shapeshift. Obviously rebuilding an engine is a pretty difficult task. It's not something that we can do all at once. So we've been doing periodic releases and updates towards this overall vision that we have. I want to summarize, I think, what some of our major achievements have been over the last 12 months or more. And if you haven't been following, maybe this is a good chance to understand how Druid has been very rapidly changing. So to start off with, this idea behind Project Shapeshift and rebuilding Druid's engine is to create a new unified engine that can be used for both ingestion into Druid as well as queries into the system as well. So Druid today has this new engine, this new block of code that you may have seen called the multi-stage query engine. This is where most of the work that we've been doing on Project Shapeshift has been happening. The multi-stage query engine today, it can do a lot of really neat things. It can do SQL-based ingestion, so you can now use SQL to load data directly into Druid. It can also do in database transformation. So you can use SQL now to transform data as well as load it into Druid. One of the really kind of powerful things we've seen since we've introduced this functionality is we've seen both folks in the community as well as some of our own customers start leveraging these capabilities to really simplify their data pipelines. In some cases, we've seen folks entirely get rid of giant sections of their data pipeline. For example, removing the need for Spark or having to transform data in Spark before it gets loaded into Druid. So this is like one of the first indications that we're maybe on the right track with the work that we've been doing on the new engine. Another major capability that we released a couple of months ago is something that internally we've been calling schemaless ingestion. It's also oftentimes called schema auto-discovery. So the idea behind schemaless ingestion or schema auto-discovery is you can post a JSON blob. You can basically load any arbitrary JSON blob into Druid. And what Druid will do is it will figure out the structure of that JSON blob. It will figure out the different types, the different columns that are possible in the data. It works natively now with kind of the nested structure that you find in JSON. And we've seen this be very powerful, especially when loading data from places such as Kafka. You can kind of just like one-click load the data. And you don't have to spend nearly as much time as you did before with regards to data modeling or thinking about the different types that exist within the data. Now, as I mentioned, the point of Project Shapeshift is to have an engine that can do not only ingestion, but queries as well. So the reason why it's called the multi-stage query engine is Druid's new engine is now able to do multi-stage queries and long-running queries and a whole breadth of much more complex queries than it could before. Some of these queries include shuffle joins, which can be done at ingest time, as well as you can do shuffle joins now at query time. This has been one of the biggest requested features from the community, the ability to do large complex joins, and that's something that's powerful it's something that's now possible in the new engine. Furthermore, the new engine allows for the separation of compute and storage as well. So today, you no longer need to load all of your data locally within Druid. You can also query for data that's stored separately in a different file system, such as S3. Now, these are some of the highlighted features that we've done in the new engine. Obviously, this doesn't encompass everything. If you're interested, there's release notes out there. There's hundreds of different things that we've added to the engine, and I highly encourage you to go and check it out. If you haven't been following some of the community roadmap things that we release from time to time, I want to cover a little bit more of it here because, as I mentioned, our big goal, our kind of huge initiative initially is to rebuild Druid's engine to support many new use cases for real-time analytics. And Jian actually is going to have a talk a little bit later that's going to cover this specific topic in a lot more detail. So I highly encourage you to go listen to his talk. But I want to kind of cover the high-level items that we're thinking about for the next year. So obviously, the multi-stage query engine is still the primary focus of what we want to build and where our development efforts are going. The multi-stage query engine is getting a whole lot of updates. The biggest change that's happening is we're adding the ability to do interactive queries in the multi-stage query engine. So the idea, if you know Druid's code base at all, is Druid has its original native engine, which is very good at these interactive, super fast queries, and this is how Druid kind of built its community. And there's this new multi-stage query engine, which is able to do a much wider spectrum of queries and have all the kind of neat things that I talked about in the prior slide. But the idea is that we want to effectively merge these engines such that the multi-stage query engine can also do interactive queries and do all the great things that Druid's native query engine was known for. Now, we've obviously talked about this idea before. If you're an implied customer, you've probably heard us talk about this concept as part of roadmap presentations. And one of the most common questions that we get is, if there's one engine that's doing more heavyweight queries and also interactive queries, is there going to be any impact to the performance of the interactive queries? And the design goal that we have and the work that we've done thus far is showcasing, no, that's not going to be the case. The fast queries are still going to be fast, and the engine is simply just going to get support for a lot more different types of queries. The goal, of course, of all this work is to ultimately give the end user full control over price performance. So if you want your queries to be super fast, if you want your application to feel really, really snappy, then you can have all of your data in memory. You can get all the features of Druid that you know and love. But if you have certain queries, certain workflows, certain workloads where you don't want all of your data stored in memory or even loaded in Druid at any given point in time, you can also store that data in a separate file system such as S3, and then query it when you actually need it. So it's getting some of the best capabilities that exist in cloud data warehouses today and merging them with the lightning fast performance that you know from Druid as well. In addition to this fundamental change in the multi-stage query engine, we're also just simply adding more features and capabilities that's completing the realm of what is possible with SQL. So in the last few releases, we've been building out window functions, and over the next few releases, we plan to have window functions in GA. We've added a lot of capabilities for what you can do with window functions. We've also added new data management commands, commands such as update, delete, and merge. These are all things that are on the Druid roadmap that we want to expand out and add additional capabilities towards. Lastly, we're doing a bunch of integrations doing more integrations, I should say, with the surrounding ecosystem. So there's new open source projects that have been launched, new standards that have been defined, new systems that people are picking up, and we want to continue being a good citizen in open source and ensuring that we have really good and tight integration with some of the most powerful and popular products in the open source ecosystem. Finally, we do this as part of every release. We don't necessarily have an explicit roadmap item, but we're looking to always make Druid easier to use. We're looking to simplify the process of tuning Druid, of configuring it so that you can get up and running with new use cases without really having to spend that much effort. So our roadmap and our vision is really defined based on our interactions with the community. As I mentioned before, learning about community use cases, learning about how we can better support certain use cases, learning about future use cases is incredibly valuable to us. So if you have any feedback towards any of these areas, we have channels, we have Slack, we have forums that you can post in, and I highly encourage that folks participate as part of the open source community. The first part of my talk was really around how Druid has been evolving and what we want to do. The second part of my talk, I want to talk about the concrete use cases that are in the back of our minds as we think about building out Druid's roadmap and as we think about building Druid as a whole. These are use cases that I've learned about with my time with the community. Some of these are new use cases that we're spending more time in. But for each of these use cases, I figured it's good to actually have a real-world example talking about what problems different companies are trying to solve and how Druid can help them solve those problems. So the first use case I wanted to talk about is actually the original use case that Druid was built for. And this is around clickstream analytics. So clickstream analytics is tracking data that's usually centered around clicks. And the use case is around understanding product usage, understanding user behavior, and understanding how users are engaging and using products. The real-world example I have here is at Atlassian, where they have a product called Confluence. Now, Confluence is, I'm sure many of you have used before, is a wiki product where you can create arbitrary wikis and you can share knowledge across a broad customer base. When we partnered with Atlassian around this clickstream use case, Atlassian built a product very similar to what we see out in the broader Druid community, which is creating a user-facing analytics product that's tracking how Confluence gets used within an organization. And this provides a lot of very valuable feedback. This provides feedback to users around how spaces and pages are performing, around which wikis are useful and potentially not useful. It provided value around providing administration rights into workspaces and how users were engaging with workspaces. So this use case, as I mentioned, Druid is the one that Druid is the most familiar with. And it's the most familiar with because online advertising engagement and ad tech is, in our mind, kind of a subset of clickstream analytics. And it's the use case that we still invest heavily in terms of the roadmap of Druid itself and how we can better support this use case. If you look at what Atlassian is doing with regards to this Confluence product, it's a pretty similar setup to, I'm sure, what many of you out there have. You have user events that are getting generated by users. Those events ultimately feed into some sort of message bus. In this case, it's Kinesis. And then Druid pulls data from that message bus directly and then powers some sort of user-facing application where people can slice and dice the data and drill into a bunch of data. There's many ways in which I think our future roadmap is going to better benefit this use case. One is some of the schemaless ingestion features that we've added means now it's easier than ever to load streaming data from message buses such as Kinesis or Kafka. You can kind of one-click load. You can one-click load data from new products, new engagements, new behaviors without having to do any complex modeling of the data, and Drew's going to handle the rest. In terms of the query patterns that we see from this use case, it's a pretty standard kind of query pattern that you'll see with Druid. There's some UI that customers engage with. The consistency of query results, the performance of those queries is incredibly important ultimately to the user experience. The types of queries are mostly group bys. They're drilling into particular filters, grouping on particular attributes, and then computing a wide set of metrics. Kind of one of the neat things that gets me excited about making this use case better is that in a lot of dashboarding products that I see, there's kind of an interactive view that users engage with, and then there's more of a reporting view, like you can download data or you can have queries which don't necessarily always need the lightning fast performance. And with Druid's upcoming roadmap of better supporting separated compute storage, you can now have that. You can have all of those queries basically flowing into Druid into the same system. You can have your lightning fast dashboarding views. You can also have your slower reports, and the data for those reports don't necessarily even need to be loaded in Druid anymore. They can reside most of the time in a separated storage layer. So the next use case I wanted to talk about is actually the second use case that we ever discovered with Druid, and that is a use case around observability. And the real world example I want to use is what the folks at Netflix are doing. So Netflix actually has an observability platform that's basically built on Druid. And it's an observability platform that ingests data from basically what people are watching on Netflix. And this is data that's generated from a variety of different types of devices, from your browser all the way to your phone. Observability itself has many different use cases, but I'll keep this relatively high level. In the observability world, Netflix uses Druid for things like real-time A/B testing or understanding key metrics for software releases, as well as alerting and triaging when there's incidents. Now, Netflix is well known for having a very large subscriber base. They have a lot of data. They have very complex data as well. So they're loading millions of events per second into Druid, loading it into a pretty kind of standard setup of getting data into Druid and then streaming that data into Kafka and then further streaming that data from Kafka into Druid as well. What I've always found pretty interesting about this use case is the sheer volume and complexity of the data. So it is trillions of rows of data that get queried at any given point in time on a data set that has hundreds, if not thousands, of dimensions to parse through. The queries themselves are a lot of slice and dice drill down queries. So it is drilling into the data based on arbitrary sets of dimensions, understanding things like playback errors, application launch errors, device quality, video quality, you pick it. There's many, many different permutations of things that are possible to triage and possible to diagnose and possible to understand as well. The data is dimensional in that there's many different attributes. The data also has very high cardinality. So for any given dimension, there could be millions of different values that exist within a different dimension. Druid, obviously over the years has evolved to handle these types of queries and to handle this workload pretty well. One of the classic things that we've heard with regards to observability is sometimes people want to issue more complex multi-stage queries. So these oftentimes take the form of very large group bys, where subqueries can be, the result set of the subquery can be pretty large. This is actually one of the classic use cases that really inspired our vision around the multi-stage query engine. And a lot of the work that we've been doing around the query side of the multi-stage query engine is to ensure that more complex analytic workloads, these very large group by queries with maybe complex subqueries, can be handled in the same system that can handle all the lightning fast diagnostic queries as well. The next use case I wanted to talk about is not one of the original use cases of Druid, but it's a use case that we've been seeing more and more in the last few years. And it's a use case that we've been learning more about and understanding and working with partners both in our community as well as commercially on. And this is a use case around IoT data. Now, IoT is obviously a very complex space. There's many different forms of IoT data, but in this real-world example, I wanted to talk a little bit about our partner Swiftly and their IoT data, which takes the form of transit data. So this is data that's getting emitted by trains, buses, ferries. It's information about how public transit is effectively faring. And the application that got built on top of this data is a real-time dashboard that's basically tracking transit options and how they're faring. The setup, once again, is a full real-time setup. It's a setup that has real-time sensor data that's coming from public transit, such as buses and ferries. This data ultimately gets emitted into a Kafka pipeline, which then gets streamed into Druid, and Druid powers a real-time application that Swiftly's customers can use and track how different transportation options are doing. This data has some pretty interesting scale as well. So there are many different vehicles, many different rider trips that need to get tracked. And then there's also requirements around being able to slice and dice and look at this data from many different facets of granularity. One of the interesting things that we've learned about the IoT use case is oftentimes metadata needs to get associated with the sensor data as well. And a lot of our work towards data management, ensuring that we have standard SQL operations like updates, deletes, upserts, and so forth. We actually had this IoT use case in mind, ensuring that when metadata gets loaded along with the sensor data, that metadata can also be appropriately updated and appropriately changed to match what's actually happening within the broader use case. So IoT is a use case that we continue to think about, we continue to invest in. If it's a use case that you have, we definitely would love to hear from you. I have one final use case that I want to talk about. Now, obviously, we can't cover every single use case that Druid can be used for, but I thought this final use case was pretty interesting, and it's one that's been emerging in our community. And that use case is around security and fraud analytics. So security and fraud analytics is really about detecting false payments or fraudulent activity within some sort of payment cycle. The real world example I have is at one of our partners, which is Ibotta. And Ibotta, for those of you that may not know, is in the business of providing consumers with cashback rewards based on everyday purchases. Now, Ibotta has a fraud mitigation team that uses real-time analytics for alerting, identification of potentially fraudulent activity, investigation of potentially fraudulent purchases, and then responses to those incidents as well. The use case at Ibotta and the setup at Ibotta doesn't actually just leverage some of the new capabilities in the multi-stage query engine. I know in a lot of the previous examples, I talked about how new features, new capabilities, or recently developed capabilities in the multi-stage query engine help enable some of the use cases that we've been thinking about. But we haven't forgotten about Druid's core capabilities. So Druid's core capabilities are around getting data in very, very quickly and around the performance of queries in terms of slicing and dicing that data. And as a community, as an organization as well, we're still very committed to Druid's core capabilities and ensuring those also are always top of class and work really, really well. So Ibotta setup is once again a pretty classic setup that we'll see in the community, where there's data streaming to some message bus, in this case Kinesis, and then streaming to Druid, and then there's various OLAP cubes that are built on top of Druid, and the slice and dice and performance of those cubes is very important. So for us as an organization, what's important for this security and fraud analytics is, of course, getting data in very quickly and getting data out very quickly as well. And many of the roadmap items that we have are simply about optimizing and ensuring that we always have best-in-class performance, that the performance to cost ratio is also best in class, and our ability to get data in as fast as possible is once again best in class as well. So the security and fraud analytics at Ibotta, obviously their use case doesn't require issuing queries to a separate storage system. It doesn't require necessarily gigantic group by queries that may take a bit longer to complete, but is rooted in what is Druid's bread and butter, which is like lightning fast, small queries that slice and dice the data very quickly. And once again, we haven't forgotten about that use case. We haven't forgotten about those query patterns. We're ensuring that we're spending appropriate resources, making sure those are always going to be best in class as well. So when I started Druid, for a long time, it was me and Eric working on Druid and working with the community. Over the years, Druid's community has grown substantially. Now, based on our latest tracking, we're over 20,000 members with more than 2,000 companies using Druid. And it's been really, really amazing to watch. I guess I just really want to take this time to thank everyone that's been a part of this community, for everyone that's either told us more about your use case or filed tickets around some of the limitations of Druid or bugs that you've hit, for people that have contributed code, that have contributed integrations. I think that the Druid community wouldn't be where it is without all of you. And for all the new members, we welcome you to this community as well. For this summit, this summit has a lot of great talks lined up. We have roadmap presentations. We have more real world use cases. We have many of the Druid commuters and PMC members, and I hope you get a chance to ask them questions, and I hope you get a chance to learn more about this awesome community that's been a really important part of my life. I guess the last part here is I am the CEO of a commercial company, so I'm going to plug my company in the last section here. At Imply, we build Druid. We build Druid for the open source, but we also build commercial products as well. And last year, we launched a product called Imply Polaris, which is a SaaS version of Druid. Our goal with Polaris has been to ensure that it's much cheaper to run Polaris than it is to run Druid yourselves, both from a hardware and software perspective, as well from people hours perspective as well. We've spent a lot of time adding enterprise security, spent a lot of time making sure that user management is up to par. And we also have kind of a long list of security certifications as well. So if you're new to Druid, you want to try it out, kick the tires, highly recommend that you check out Polaris. And lastly, we see new companies join the Druid community every single day. We'd love to learn more about your use case. As I've mentioned, we'd love to learn more about what you're doing. We'd love to learn about what Druid is helping you with and what you wish it could help you with. So if this is your first time to the community, once again, welcome. If you've been here for many years, once again, thank you so much for all the feedback that you provided. And thank you for being a part of this year's Druid Summit.